It's so nice to see who's here and to see so many familiar names and organizations. I will and continue to encourage you all to share a word of how you're feeling, in addition to sharing where you are coming from, just sort of how we are entering into this space. So I'm hearing some excitement, I'm hearing some gratitude, but would love to hear more of how folks are entering in relaxed. That's great to hear. So, as we are entering into this space, I want to acknowledge that each one of us is carrying with us different energy this morning for so many different reasons. For some of us, we might be holding some personal gratitude, personal excitement. I'm so glad to hear that there are some folks who are feeling gratitude and excitement this morning, as well as recognizing that some of us may also be feeling some exhaustion. I also want to just name that, some of the thoughtfulness and intention of the timing of this presentation was recognizing that we have now surpassed a year of living in this global pandemic, and that many of us may be carrying with us some cumulative toll from that experience, some ongoing exhaustion. We might be hearing and feeling our own personal grief or collective grief. I also want to acknowledge that many of us might be entering into this space feeling particularly dysregulated, struggling to process, or also just to grieve the lives that were lost in Atlanta. And so many examples of the violence that comes as a result of white supremacy that can be fatal, but also the insidious nature of white supremacy culture, the ongoing impact of that many of us may also be carrying with us into this space, a lot of different experiences, feelings, emotions, physical sensations, some of which we can name, some of which we can just feel, some of which may feel in some ways in direct opposition to one another. And I start this way just to invite you all to cultivate some curiosity throughout today's conversation about how we do enter into these spaces, what we are carrying with us, what we've been able to name to ourselves and to others, what we may have just been feeling. I think one of the things that I'm so aware of and that I will be talking more about later on is that so much of my own sustainability in this work comes from doing it in community. And that in reality, many of us have been feeling especially depleted and isolated this year. And so, for that reason and so many others, I am incredibly honored and grateful to get to guide this conversation and facilitate this dialogue. And in order to do so, I'm really going to encourage you all to think about how we care for ourselves during this conversation rather than something we have to do later. We started this already by sort of asking ourselves the question of how am I entering into the space? What am I feeling right now? I really want to impress upon everyone that we have a lot of messages, both external and internal, that we carry with us from our families, from our personal stories that we hear in our professional spaces, that if we care enough, we won't stop doing, that we just have to keep going. And I really want to give this message that I deeply, deeply believe that if we care for ourselves, it is part of and integral to our ability to be able to do the work to the degree that we hope to, that it is caring about our work. It is not separate from, but integral to the care of ourselves and the care of each other. So noticing if you're feeling energized, if you're feeling exhausted, noticing if you're having trouble sort of focusing on this conversation, if you find yourself opening emails or different tabs on your screen, not with any judgment, just with some curiosity. Notice if you can feel your body in this moment. Can you feel your feet on the floor? Do you notice your temperature? Are you feeling hot and agitated, or just hot because it's stuffy in the room that you're in? Are you feeling cold and chilled? Can you do anything to care for that in this moment? Do you need anything in this moment? Do you need a glass of water? Do you need to move your body? Do you need to stand up? Do you need to stretch? Do you need to eat breakfast? Whatever it is that you might need to be more present for this conversation and to honor yourself, I deeply encourage you to do that. One of the small benefits of doing a webinar style, although I wish I could see your faces and hear your voices, is that we can't see you. So please feel free to do and be however you need to in this space in order to be present. So please inspire your colleagues and myself by sharing one simple thing that you can do to care for yourself during this conversation. It doesn't need to be anything large and overt. It can be something very small, but we know something we like to say at Reach, the organization I come from, is that small actions can often make a big difference. So one thing that I will do to continue to remain grounded and slow down is just remind myself to take a sip of water every so often. And just as I do so, allowing that to be something that brings me into the present moment, noticing the temperature of the water, noticing how it feels just to swallow for a moment, and just to be able to inhale rather than exhale. What do we need to bring in so that we can continue to be able to offer out? So I encourage you to share in the chat so that we can, really inspire one another and also feel that sense of community with one another. So far, I'm seeing drink water. So I've got a friend in the hydration group. Stand and stretch from time to time. Open the window next to me to get some fresh air. Inhale and exhale intentionally. Drink water, look out the window, pay attention to my posture. Go out for a little bit of fresh air during the day. So sometimes even just making that commitment to ourselves can bring us into that same sense of groundedness, even if it's something we're not doing in this exact moment. Get up and move, have my coffee, a water, take occasional peeks at the picture of my cat on my desk, love it. Enjoy this delicious large cup of coffee and breathe in the fresh air. Doodle. Focus on my breathing, what I'm bringing in and what I'm releasing out. Beautiful. Check in with my internal self. Let myself have a snack. Yes, absolutely. Be aware of the tension in my neck and face. I love this. Keep them coming, and please continue to read what your colleagues are offering to you. I know that I will be inspired, and I imagine that many of us will be as well. So for today's conversation, I know we got a little bit of a late start, but I do very much appreciate everyone, supporting us and making sure that this conversation can be accessible to all our participants. We're going to start by examining, as we've already started to do, how we are entering into today's conversation and connecting that to how we enter into this work, the experiences we have in this work, how we make meaning of those experiences, and ending with some tangible strategies for collective and individual sustainability. Just to mention some of the concepts that you'll hear me reference, and just things that I've been really thinking about and sort of centering on as I've been planning this conversation. I think many of us know, but I think we don't often explicitly state that many of us are drawn to this work because of our own personal connection and our own personal traumas or the traumas of our loved ones. In fact, if we look at the founding stories of so many of our organizations, so often our founders were really driven by their personal connection to this work. So I think that's important for us to explicitly name, and that's definitely going to be a theme that we come back to throughout today's conversation. Also, doing this work doesn't make us, immune from still experiencing some of these things. And I also want to be explicit about that because I have seen firsthand the shame that folks can experience, which only adds layers to their suffering if they feel like they should have been able to avoid an experience such as domestic or sexual violence because they work in this field, and feel more isolated and disconnected from this community because we don't name that this can still happen even if we're doing this work. And in fact, we're going to hear more, not just in our professional lives, but in our personal lives as well. When people learn that we're doing this work, many of our loved ones will seek us out for support, whether about something that's happening currently or something that happened a long time ago that we didn't know about. And that has an impact too. The work that we do is sacred and it is impactful. And burnout is not inevitable. I very much believe that our movement continues to grow and evolve because we are able to find ways to sustain ourselves. My hope is that we can continue to make that a priority area of our movement and not an afterthought, to ensure the health of our movement and all the people that make that movement possible and a reality. I believe very much that it's not the work we do, but the environment that we do it in that contributes most to our burnout. So we're going to be talking pretty specifically about that. And if we are dedicated to addressing and preventing harm, we are all coming from different organizations today with slightly different lenses, but I would imagine that that's a big shared motivation of the organizations we work for, as well as for our own personal convictions, that we want to see a world free of domestic and sexual violence. If we are doing the work professionally and externally to try to prevent and eradicate that harm, we have to do everything within our power to ensure that we are preventing and eradicating harm within our organizations as well. Because when we feel cared for and cared about, we are capable of so much, of innovation, of transformation, and so much more. I did just want to share with you all some books that are going to be informing our conversation. Some of you are very familiar with these, I know. I have them with me right now. This book, Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, is one that I became more recently aware of. And I really, really highly recommend it. It was written by two sisters, Emily and Amelia Nagoski. And they offer some really concrete strategies to unlocking and releasing the stress cycle that we'll definitely talk about today. But if you're interested in doing a deeper dive, I know many of you are very familiar with Laura Van Lipsky's work and trauma stewardship. I hope many of you have been able to attend her institutes in the past. If you are less familiar with her work, we're going to be watching her TED Talk later on in today's conversation. So that will be a good introduction, and I'm happy to share that information with all of you as well. So I've had the distinct honor of getting to work with and work for an organization called Reach Beyond Domestic Violence for almost 8 years now. And a few years ago, we went through a strategic planning process. And as part of that process, we had the opportunity to re-articulate our vision, mission, and value statements. And so to ground the conversation today, I'm going to ground myself in this dialogue, utilizing those 4 core values that we articulated. The first being this idea that we're all in this together. And I want to acknowledge that this is a phrase that gets tossed around a lot, especially in the past year, and sometimes in ways that aren't necessarily supportive and can actually be harmful. I'm going to be sharing some of my personal experience with you all today and my personal narrative. And I'm not doing so because I believe that my story is prescriptive of someone else's, but rather because I believe so much in the power of storytelling. And I believe that it has been storytelling that has strengthened and evolved our movement. And I believe it is our responsibility to each other and to this work that we care so deeply about to think about how we foster and seek spaces to create room for more narratives so that we are able to see the breadth and depth of the people who make up our movement and to ensure that we are really embracing the complexity of the human experience as we're thinking about how we do this work together. As part of that, I also want to really acknowledge that one of the things that I've noticed has been particularly harmful that I think, may come from really often well-intentioned, but can have a really negative impact that I want to be thinking about with you all today, is when we find ourselves beginning to speak in sort of us-them language when we are thinking about the work that we do, when we find ourselves applying a different set of expectations or policies or procedures for the survivors we work with who seek us out for services than the survivors we work with within our offices. So an example of this that I saw pretty early into my career, I was working for an organization. I was going through the interview process. And you will learn more of my story, but especially in the beginning of my career, I always talked about the fact that I was a survivor, sort of first and foremost. And I'll talk about why that was and how that's evolved over time. So in my interview process, in my presentations, in my conversations with different colleagues, I was very forthcoming with that information that I identify as a survivor of sexual and domestic violence. The organization I was applying to work for and did work for a period of time had a written policy that was sent to each candidate that said that in order to be eligible for employment, if you had a history of domestic violence, you had to have been out of that relationship for at least a year. And again, I can understand some of the intention behind that policy, but I also saw firsthand the impact that that had. As I mentioned earlier, just because we do this work doesn't prevent us from being able to experience these things, whether in our past or in our present. Because I was so outspoken about being a survivor, I became someone that a lot of my colleagues would seek for support, both about their own survivorship that they didn't feel comfortable sharing with other colleagues, or about situations they were currently in, but didn't feel like they could tell anyone for fear of losing their job. This is just one concrete example that I want us to be thinking about. Again, I'm going to give specifics, not because I think that they tell the whole story, but I think it's important for us to be specific when we're trying to think about what gets in our way. When we see amazing people working for amazing organizations burning out one by one, and we see the detrimental impact that has in the organization and all the survivors and communities that we're trying to serve, when we see places where it feels like a revolving door, organizations I've worked for where it felt like almost every day we were either doing a welcome breakfast or a goodbye lunch, what is happening within these organizations that is making it feel impossible to be sustainable within those spaces? Some of that comes from that isolation and that shame when we begin to talk about this work and talk about survivors as an other, rather than this being part of who we are and part of the organization that we are. I mentioned the book Trauma Stewardship, and again, we'll get to watch the amazing Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky speak her words through her TED Talk in just a few minutes. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what trauma stewardship is, because it's going to guide some of the ways in which we enter into this conversation today. With trauma stewardship, Laura asks us to examine how we come to this work, what inspired us to do this work, how we are impacted by the work that we do, and how we learn from and make meaning of these experiences. I'm going to invite you throughout today and ongoing to do some of that personal reflection, to think about what inspired you to enter into this field. I imagine for most of us, it wasn't because of the huge paycheck that's associated with doing this work. But what motivated you to enter into this work? What have been some of the meaningful moments that you've had along the way? And what continues to sustain you to show up every day, to do this work together and to do this work at all? And if we're going to talk about trauma mastery, I think it's also important that we talk about what trauma is, because we all have different definitions. Here you can see some different examples. I have found this first definition on the right-hand side to be the most meaningful to me in guiding my work, but also understanding my own healing process. That trauma is a profound and meaningful loss of control over our experience. Traumas aren't just singular events like a car accident. They can be chronic, they can be inherited, they can be collective, they can be so complex, and they can intersect and they can happen concurrently. And I think especially in this past year, we have felt that deeply, and we have, many of us, experienced that profoundly. So Reach's second core value, which I think really speaks to the nature of today's conversation, is this concept that we care for ourselves and we care for one another. We articulated that we recognize that the survivors, staff, and volunteers are more than the trauma they've experienced or the job functions they perform. Whatever brings us into our space when we're able to be in space together is more than a job title. And I think for me, being able to articulate that with my colleagues, being able to have that in all of our materials, to be able to share that with all of you, feels like the culmination of so much that I have been working towards in my own work. Because I think for so long there has been, and I know I have internalized messages that as much as we are promoting healthy relationships and well-being for communities and individuals we serve, we often sacrifice our own well-being because we feel like it is necessary to do so in order to really show up, in order to really do our work well. And again, I want to be challenging that a bit. So an example of this that you may have noticed in all of the slides so far is I have our hotline listed on every single slide. And it's not just to promote our services. In fact, that's really not it at all. It's really about reminding us that we are in this work together, that we are human beings that have complex histories, that many of us are drawn to this work because of our own trauma history or our current experiences or those of our loved ones. And we may need support, and we deserve to have that. And so just knowing that that hotline is available to every single one of us to be able to access some confidential support and to feel heard is something that I want, again, to make really explicit. In bold, you can see the sentiment, we are human beings, not human doings. You've probably heard this before. My late brother-in-law used to say this a lot. And I think for myself, I have realized that historically, part of what has contributed to times when I have been experiencing burnout, when I have been less sustainable in this work, is when I place an overemphasis on my value being about what I do rather than who I am. And really sort of centering my identity around what I can do, especially for others, rather than how I show up into a space. So I'm curious if that resonates for others. And I think in particular, I led a similar conversation at a staff meeting last April. And we talked about this idea of what it means to not be able to do our work in the ways that we had been so reliant on doing them before, of being able to show up for a survivor with our whole bodies rather than trying to do so on Zoom or over the phone, to be able to engage a group by being in space together and being able to be moving around the room with all of you rather than wishing I could see all of your faces. So when the world changed in so many ways a year ago and our ability to do was so impacted by that, how has that changed your relationship to your work, your organization, and to yourself? So I'm going to pause for a moment just to give folks an opportunity to share in the chat. I would love to hear from you. And I should mention you're welcome to private or direct chat myself if it's more comfortable to do so. You are also welcome to just message the panelists or to message all panelists and attendees if you'd like other folks to be able to see your response. Working in my home, so having to think about boundaries differently. I was hired during the pandemic, so this is all I've known. You definitely have colleagues who have that experience as well. I always had a ride or a transition period from home to work. I had to learn to take better care of myself without that separation. I resonate with that so much, not having that opportunity to decompress. There was increased need with no work or home separation. I had to learn to take better care of myself. Working evenings feels really different with my partner and dog just behind the door in the next room. Realizing that as a disabled worker, I do need a lot more time working from home rather than having to go into the office every day. Thank you all so much. Not having the face-to-face interpersonal interactions has been disconnecting. At times, I miss seeing people and interacting. This is not a simple question. I felt I've had to adapt, be creative, but I feel less appreciated. I've learned to take care of myself more, incorporated art and creativity into work and personal time. It has been difficult to help others when you're going through the same thing, adopting working from home. It's also hired during the pandemic, and this is been all I know. Isolation has been tough, but has encouraged me to seek help to better take care of myself. Thank you all so much for your honesty. has created possibilities for me. I've worked for Casa while I lived in Boston and moved back to my hometown in Pennsylvania during the pandemic. I had to quit my job and was able to get my job back because of the pandemic and being able to work from home. It is a job I hold close to my heart, so this possibility and opportunity is a blessing to me. Thank you for sharing that. Working from home and living alone is very isolating, but it helped me work on self-care every day. I do appreciate still being employed, absolutely. At the beginning, I want to make sure I don't miss anyone. At the beginning, it was frightening to not hear the phone ring as it had before. Finding new ways to reach people was invigorating, but exhausting as the hotline's calls increased to higher rates than ever. That compounded with stress and solitude. Thank you all so much. So I've referenced a little bit of my story already, but just to sort of demonstrate and model this idea of examining how we enter into this work, making meaning of the experiences we have in this work, and then being able to create strategies for sustainability. I'm going to share a little bit of my own story and specifically how I entered into this work. And in thinking about that, there's really sort of two key turning points for me of how I think about my entrance into this work of sexual and domestic violence prevention and intervention. The first came in kind of an unlikely source. I was sitting in a high school assembly in my high school auditorium with over 600 of my peers, feeling pretty disengaged. And we had been asked to come to a mandatory assembly to learn about a new program that was starting at my school. And I saw it as an opportunity to catch up with friends and not pay a whole lot of close attention. But partway through the presentation, I began to pick up on more of what the folks who were presenting were sharing. They came from an organization that was addressing the way that they defined it, men's violence against women. And they were trying to recruit young people to join this organization and to be a part of this as a new student club. And to try to inspire motivation and really get folks to care about this issue, they shared some statistics. And I'm not a big fan of statistics. I don't tend to find them to be particularly impactful. However, on this day, the statistics they shared were life-changing for me. So at that time, they shared that 1 in 4 women will experience sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime. And I was sitting with my 3 best girlfriends, and it occurred to me as I said that we made up 4 women. And then as they continued to talk and define what they meant by those terms, sexual and domestic violence, I began to realize that the things they were describing sounded incredibly familiar to me. And it dawned on me sitting in that auditorium that myself and my 3 friends already made up this statistic. That as a sophomore in high school, I was realizing for the first time experiences I had had the prior year, but had no way of telling anyone about it. I simply didn't have the words. And I often talked about this experience like a match was lit for me. It felt very much like there was suddenly a spotlight shining right over my seat. And there was something inherently isolating in thinking about myself as a 1 in 4. But most what I remember feeling was anger, a whole lot of anger that I didn't know these things before, that I didn't have the simple tools of language to be able to tell someone what I was experiencing and to access the support that I felt like I probably should have received. So that match was lit, and I felt incredibly motivated to join whatever it was they were doing, which happened to be peer-to-peer education. And so I got incredibly involved with this club and started educating my peers, first educating myself, and then educating younger students as well. And I found this work to be incredibly motivating and inspiring and gave me sort of a new sense of purpose. And then my world completely changed. Less than a year later, in August, I was sexually assaulted by the person that I trusted most in this world. And it happened in a place I felt completely safe, which was my own home. And there were a lot of reasons why I thought this could never happen, many of which had to do with the person. and how much I inherently trusted and cared about them, as well as the place. So often we get messages about, being hyper vigilant in spaces outside of our homes. But my home was always a place up until that point that felt safe to me. But I also think that I very much believed that because I wasn't just knowledgeable now, but I was actually training other young people about these topics, that this couldn't have or shouldn't have happened to me. The next day was my 16th birthday, and I spent that day sharing with my friends who had gathered together to celebrate me, pulling them aside one by one and telling them what had happened the night before. But I was completely and utterly in shock. And it was as if I were a robot just dispensing information to all of my loved ones. I want to be explicitly clear that my story is shaped by my trauma, but is also very much shaped by my privilege. It's shaped by my racial privilege, by my economic privilege. It's shaped by the privilege of having family and friends who immediately believed me. And it is also shaped by the privilege of where I lived, that I was already connected to an organization that was doing this work, and that I lived close enough to Boston that I had at my fingertips an incredible network of organizations that would go on to support me and mentor me for years and years to come, for over 2 decades now that I've been doing this work. Those first couple of weeks following my assault, I was completely stuck in a freeze response. And I remember waking up every morning and forgetting for a second what had happened. And then my body would remind me, and I would have this resounding question circulating through my head every day, constantly. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? It was easier for me at that point to imagine that the person that I had loved and trusted had simply passed away, and that the person who had inflicted this harm on me was some unidentifiable monster. But in reality, what it really shook and what it really devastated for some time was my ability to trust myself, because I deeply inherently blamed myself, that I should have known better, that I shouldn't have let this happen. But a couple of weeks after being stuck in freeze, some of that frozen ice began to thaw just a little bit. And I woke up one day and decided that that question was no longer going to be a question that haunted me. This was going to be a question that challenged me. I could not change what this person had done. And to me, that was my definition of what it meant to be a victim. That is what this person inflicted upon me. But what I could choose and what I did have control over was everything that I did next, which to me was my definition of being a survivor. I could survive this, and I could choose that path for myself. And in particular, I knew that part of what I needed in that moment to survive was to believe that this was not going to be in vain. I thought back on that assembly that I had been to less than a year prior, and how impacted I was simply by hearing statistics shared on that stage. And I made the decision that if I were allowed, I would get on that stage that following October, and I would share my own story for the first time. Much of my early work always had this title of breaking the silence. I believed part of what made me more vulnerable to these things happening was the fact that I didn't know that it could happen to me. And I wanted to ensure that no one else was, unaware that these things happened. I wanted to make sure that everyone had that information I so desperately wished that I had. So a couple of months after my assault, we had our sophomore assembly. Students were gathering in the auditorium, and the advisors to my club, who I had been telling for the past couple of months what my experience was and my desire to share my speech, asked to see it for the first time. I had been working on a speech to tell my story almost since my assault had occurred. And I had done so with support from family and friends and from a therapist. And I felt very much like this was the way I needed to tell this story. But moments before I was called on stage, the advisors to my program, asking for the first time to see my words, decided that I could not give that speech. And I was told that it was too scary and it was too intense and it was not appropriate for the age group, the same age group that I was in when this experience had happened. And it was like someone took that match that had been lit the year before and poured gasoline on it. That freeze response dissipated, and I began to feel in every fiber of my being my fight response kicking on. So the advisor to the program asked me if I knew what I was going to say. She said I was allowed to speak and I was allowed to say I was a survivor, but I wasn't allowed to share anything else about my experience. And of course, by this point, we're over time. We're supposed to be going. I'm supposed to be on stage speaking. And she asked, "Do you know what you're going to say?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Can I hear it?" And I said, "You can hear it when everyone else does." And so I walked on stage with no speech in hand and told the audience exactly what had happened, that I had prepared a speech about my experience of sexual assault to share with them. And I was told that I couldn't give it because it was too scary and too intense, and that I agreed with that. It was scary and it was intense. But I also believed that I needed to say these things because they were happening and not just to me. And so I gave my speech from memory. And for those of you who do know me and have seen me out and about speaking pre-pandemic, many people comment on how I never use notes. And that really was a trauma response, a feeling that if I didn't write anything down, then nobody could censor me again. That was my entry into this work. That was how I began the work that I have been doing now for over 20 years. And what I've come to realize over time is that for the beginning of my career as a young person, I made my survivorship my primary identity. Everywhere I went, that is what I wanted people to know. I wanted to speak into existence the truth that anyone and everyone can be a survivor. I wanted to remove the stigma and shame that I knew so many survivors felt. But I think it was also a way of coping, of claiming it for myself. And there's lots of impacts of doing it that way. But over time, I was able to do really amazing, meaningful work in my community. And as I moved throughout my career in different ways, which I'll speak on later. But I also realized that as I evolved and as my healing process went on, over time, my survivorship was no longer what I claimed as my primary identity. Instead, it was my professional work that was so tied into my survivorship that became my primary professional identity. And that was my superpower, but it also made me more vulnerable to burnout. Because I felt this work on a visceral level, because I spoke so frequently as a survivor, it meant that many people disclosed and shared their experiences with me. Because I utilized my survivorship as my primary identity, it meant that everywhere I went, be it a social gathering, be it, college, be it a new job, that's what people knew about me. And so I never took that part of my identity off. I would have disclosures happen at the grocery store. I would have someone come up to me at a fraternity party wanting to talk about some programming they'd seen me do and wanting to share their own story or ask about mine. And so I never stopped, and I felt like I couldn't. I was coming from that place of still burning, of still being stuck in fight. And one of the things that I've realized is that burnout doesn't just impact the person who is burning, it impacts everyone around them. I've had the opportunity to work for so many incredible people who've been in this movement for far longer than I have. And in many ways, this conversation is like a love letter to them, especially in my earliest years as a 16, 17-year-old, wanting to set the world on fire and wanting to share my story in every place and space I could. There were so many incredible people who are part of organizations and still are today who lifted me up and supported and mentored me because I was young and because I was a survivor rather than in spite of it. Because so often we invalidate people for those reasons rather than really recognize the expertise that they bring to this work. And yet, because of that, because I was so invested in this being who I was, in addition to what I did, it made boundaries feel in many ways impossible, that it was all just one. And part of that is a recognition that when you're working from a place of fight all the time, that's not how our nervous systems are supposed to exist. And when you're unable to separate, if someone had said to me, I'm worried you're burning out, it would have felt like a personal attack because my professional identity was so connected to my survivorship that they thought I wasn't capable of doing this work. And therefore, I had to work harder to prove that I could. So I know I've shared a lot in terms of my own experiences, starting to paint a picture of sort of my own entry into this work. And I'm starting to talk about burnout. And I'm curious what burnout looks like to you and how you can tell if a loved one or a colleague is headed in that direction or is burned out. So if you would be so kind to share in the chat, I'll give you some examples as folks are typing. I will say, for me, especially when I got my first professional gig doing this work, I felt very much like I imagine professional athletes must have felt like the first time they got paid to play their sport that they loved so much, because this was everything to me. I loved this, and I did it for free for so long as an unpaid intern or volunteer or as a community organizer. And so the fact that someone thought I was worthy enough to receive a paycheck, no matter how small it was, I felt like I had to prove every single day that I was worthy of that. And so I wanted to be the first one in and the last one out every single day. I was leading community trainings late into the night, and I still felt like I needed to be the first one in the office. And I can remember one example of burnout for me was just utter exhaustion, just laying in the fetal position on my kitchen floor, just unable to find any energy. So one small, maybe particularly uh, meaningful example of what burnout may look like, but very often it's a lot more subtle. So what does burnout look like when you see it in someone else or when you recognize it in yourself? Jokes, even numbness, they don't show up. Avoidance, delays and tasks, emails, feeling like we have to do everything ourselves. It has to be us and we can never do enough. For me, it's when I see something innocent or beautiful and my thoughts are consumed by trauma, violence, hate, or tragedy. It usually takes another person to point it out to me and for me to realize I need a break. That's such a powerful example. Overwhelmed with work and still can't stop, becoming so exhausted and don't have anything left to give anyone. Impatience with colleagues and family and even friends. I think that each human carries their own characteristics and things that make them them. When you notice that that colleague or loved one seems off balance or those characteristics aren't as pleasantly present, that can be a sign. Absolutely. It needs to be really specific to that person. Feeling tense and impatient, everything seems bleak. Burnout for me looks like being extremely irritable, self isolation, or self deprecating jokes. I can tell coworkers are burnt out when their responses become more lackluster or their outward responses change dramatically or drastically. I've learned a good indicator for me is a lack of daydreaming. That's so amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to start paying more attention to that. Psychological exhaustion. Keep them coming. I'm going to just talk for a moment about some ways of defining burnout, not being mindful of a beautiful day. Absolutely. Sadness, irritable, no empathy. So the term burnout was coined back in the 1970s. And I think what I really appreciate about the two books that I mentioned before is that they very much recognize that burnout and trauma exposure response are not just something we may experience from our professional work, but rather what it means to be caring for other people. And so thinking about parental burnout, I know many of us talked about that lack of boundary between home and work, whether that's just a physical boundary or the people who exist in those spaces. So thinking a little bit about burnout, emotional exhaustion, the fatigue that comes from caring too much for too long, depersonalization, the depletion of empathy, caring, compassion. Some of you mentioned that as examples. Decreased sense of accomplishment, an unconquerable sense of futility, feeling that nothing you do makes a difference. Something that I reflected on as I was preparing for today's conversation was that by never writing anything down, even though that was part of my sort of trauma response, it also meant that I created this self-fulfilling prophecy that it was all on me because nobody could step in and do what I did because there was nothing to look at or see to be able to understand what I was doing or what I was saying or what I had planned. This concept has been incredibly helpful for me this year in understanding what emotions really are. And I think very often we hold shame about having emotions themselves. Maybe not us personally, but generally emotions aren't something that we necessarily give their due respect. So emotions aren't just feelings we choose to have, they're neurobiological responses that need to be completed. So Brene Brown talks about this concept that we often mistake ourselves as thinking beings who sometimes feel. And in reality, we're feeling beings who sometimes think. So exhaustion happens when we don't complete that response. And that can sometimes happen when we're not able to sort of get the authors of burnout talk about, emotions are like a tunnel. So there's a beginning, middle, and end of that neurobiological response, and you have to complete it. You have to get to that light on the other end of the tunnel. But sometimes we get stuck in that tunnel, and that's when that emotional exhaustion comes up. Sometimes that happens because we're living with the chronic stressor. So the stressor being the thing that's causing the stress, which can then, of course, lead to chronic stress. So if we think about systemic racism, being born into a system when we are treated as less than, that being a chronic stressor in our lives. Living through a global pandemic could be a chronic stressor that we are experiencing. Sometimes we're unable to complete the emotional response because of social appropriateness. So feeling like if we really voice our anger in our workspace, that we will be discredited or potentially even lose our jobs, which is deeply connected also to our safety. So in her book, Trauma Stewardship, Laura Vandriet Lipsky offers this image of the different examples of a trauma exposure response. I know they're small, so I'll read some of them aloud. I'm curious if any of these particularly resonate with you. Some of you have mentioned these already. So this idea of grandiosity and inflated sense of importance related to one's work. I think I've called myself on that a few times already. Feeling helpless and hopeless, a sense that one can never do enough. Hypervigilance, diminished creativity, an inability to embrace complexity, minimizing, chronic exhaustion and physical ailments, an inability to listen, deliberate avoidance, dissociative moments, a sense of persecution, guilt, fear, anger, and cynicism. And she really talks about cynical humor as being an example of this, and an inability to empathize and numbing. And I want to just stress that I think numbing in particular is incredibly seductive. And I think sometimes gets recognized in really positive ways in this work that, we numb ourselves out so completely that we feel like we can keep going because the things we hear, I've heard it 1,000 times. I've seen it 1,000 times. And so sometimes people celebrate that as like, wow, this person has been in this work for so long. They've seen it all. And really recognizing that that can be a coping strategy, but it can also be deeply harmful to ourselves and to others. Because if we're numbing out our pain, we're also numbing out our joy. And if we are in a place of numbness, we're less aware of the impact that we're having on others. I'm curious if any of the trauma exposure responses stand out to you. And as folks are sharing in the chat, any that resonate with you, I also want to acknowledge that Laura talks about the impact being cumulative. So it's not just, oh, I had a bad day today. It's that I've been doing this work where I am given the opportunity to bear the witness to the suffering of others, which is sacred work. I'm also caring for my children or for my elder parents or for my community. And I'm carrying all of those experiences with me, as well as my own trauma history. And over time, that continues to build if we don't have a way to really release and address that response. I am just going to let folks know, and I can see the closed captioning is on now. I'm actually going to hold off on showing the video for now, since we had to start a little bit late. And if we have time at the end, I will show it, but I want to make sure we don't rush through the specific strategies that we want to discuss at the end. And so I'm going to hold off for now, but thank you for the person who turned on the closed captioning. Cynicism, often bad jokes. Grandiosity. Loss of joy. I don't expect folks to memorize all of them, so I'll put them back up so folks have that to reference if there are any others that really resonate with you. And we may find ourselves more susceptible to some of these at certain times in our lives. Guilt. I think especially when the pandemic first started and we first went into shutdown, I think that sense of one can never do enough when we were so limited in our ways of being able to do our work, but we could see the need so concretely increase, just feeling like we need to do more and more and more. Inability to embrace complexity. And going into survival brain, which is very black and white thinking for a reason, right? To help us survive. It can be impactful in how we do our work. Extreme worry about my children becoming survivors. Yeah, thank you for naming that. Our hypervigilance for ourselves and for our loved ones, reflecting on stories we hear and carrying them with us. Sense of one person never being able to do enough. So I'm gonna move past the video. I hope we have time to watch it together, but I will send it to all of you. So if we don't, we'll get there. But I really want to make sure we leave here not just talking about burnout and overwhelm, but really importantly, what do we do about it? So I'm curious, and you can write in the chat if you want to, you don't have to, but just to take a moment and reflect on what your emotional response is to the word self-care. For some of us, it might feel like, oh, yes, self-care. Okay, this is my superpower, or this is when I really get to take care of myself. And for some of us, it might come up as a, yeah, that's one more thing I never have time for, or never have money for, or the resources for. Or we might struggle with guilt and feelings of selfishness when we think about self-care. I've got some folks saying feeling helpless and hopeless at times, hearing so much pain and negativity daily. Annoyance as a response. What good is self-care in a community that does not care for us? So in thinking about healing individually and collectively, I feel like one of the really important components of the process is just being able to identify what gets in our way. And so even just acknowledging the last thing that was shared in the chat, annoyance, what good is caring for myself when our community doesn't care for us? Thinking about, again, our internalized and externalized messages of self-worth and value. and the value of our work as a whole and of us as individuals. So some of the things that make it difficult for us to even have a conversation about self-care, let alone practice it, is internalized messages that we've received, feelings of guilt, time and resources. So one of the things that I hear very often from colleagues in the field is that, you can go to almost any organization doing trauma-based work, and there's always a conversation, or there's often a conversation about self-care is so important, but how is that actually being supported? So if you're saying self-care is important, but we don't have benefits to support that, or we aren't being paid enough to support that, if we're not given time in our workday, but rather being told, just go home early if you had, a rough night on call last night, you can leave a little early today. The assumption being that I can then go home and take care of myself, when in reality, I'm probably taking care of many other people in my life, or other things I haven't been able to do because I'm so focused on being at work all of the time. We really have to examine, again, shifting from individual self-care as a responsibility of the individual to collective care. One thing I did learn in this past year is self-care. Someone shared, I take time out to read, walk, run, listen to music, to name a few things. It's beautiful. Something I've also come to realize is that very often it can be the same action, but it's all about the intention we bring to it. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that collective care means an organization is bringing in a masseuse every day and providing massages to every single staff member. Because first and foremost, that really may not be what most people need or want, right? But being able to build in time and space to really take intention around examining the impact of this work, being able to do so in groups, being able to do so one-on-one, and being able to give the time and space and be able to normalize that that is part of those work, that that is part of our work. The concept that if I care enough, I won't stop, the blurred lines between work and home that many of us are experiencing during COVID-19, feeling that it's all on us. So it's one more thing I have to do. And very often when we're caring for so many people in our professional and personal lives, the things we need to do for ourselves are always going to take the back burner. We also don't have a lot of really specific examples of what this looks like on an individual level, but also what this looks like on a collective level. So core value number 3 that we articulated at Reach is how we do our work matters. So if we are in the work of promoting healthy relationships, we must embody healthy relationships, and health is imperative to that. If we want to be increasing the well-being of the survivors who come to us for services and thinking about supporting the well-being of our communities, how are we supporting the well-being of our colleagues? So part of that is being really explicit in shifting from, again, this concept of self-care to community care, and thinking about what does that require of us to shift or change in practice, not just in words, but what are we actually doing? What are action steps we can do to create meaningful change around this? And holding this belief that if we really believe that caring for ourselves and each other is not separate from, but rather integral to our ability to do our work, what does that look like in practice? So some concrete examples of this. First and foremost, I think just being able to name explicitly that this work has impact. Having an organizational culture where people are encouraged to ask questions, to talk about impact, rather than that being seen as a weakness and their inability to do this work. When folks come in with this attitude of, I've got it, I've got it, I've got it, I always want to be really gentle as a supervisor of recognizing that that often is, because I see it so much in myself when I started this work as well, this survival response of not wanting to appear weak or vulnerable in any way. So redefining what we mean by strength and efficacy and what it means to do a good job. That is so much more about who we are than what we do. And how are we actually creating space for this within the workday, rather than asking people to make that their personal responsibility outside of their work time? So an example of this that many of us in this field may be familiar with, may get to experience, is clinical supervision. A time when we really just get to examine how this work has impacted us, what's coming up for us in this work. in a confidential space. And we had historically done that for direct service staff members, which I think is really commendable because I've done direct service and not received clinical supervision, so I know it's not always a given. But also when I started at Reach, something that became really important to me was providing that for folks who do community engagement and prevention work. Because when we're out in the community and engaging in these dialogues, we see and hear so much. We need a space to process that, and that has to be part of our work because it is our work. It is not separate from, but deeply, deeply linked to our ability to do our work and to be able to do it well. Some of you might be familiar with this framework. I was introduced to it 8 years ago when I started at Reach. This comes from our friends at the Full Frame Initiative. Their website is at the bottom. And this really helped me sort of better be able to articulate what we're working towards and what sometimes gets in our way. So the Full Frame Initiative articulated that each one of us has these 5 domains of well-being. And when I look at these 5 domains now, a year into this global pandemic, and I think about social connectedness, stability and predictability, safety, mastery, meaningful access to relevant resources. So many of these have been impacted, if not all of them, in really deep and unprecedented ways by this pandemic. And I know many of us are aware of the fact that, we often find that we do a disservice to ourselves and to our colleagues or to the survivors that we are serving when we overemphasize the domain of one of these, domains of well-being to the detriment of the others. So historically, domestic violence organizations, as an example, overemphasizing the domain of safety, creating policies and procedures that were incredibly rule-based and took away the autonomy of survivors, taking away more choice and more control when they were seeking out our services because they were already experiencing that in their abusive relationship. So when we think about our success as organizations, we often, and I hope many of us, are using frameworks like these to think about, redefine what we mean as success. So being able to support survivors and recognizing what they need in each of these domains in order to be able to thrive, and recognizing that each one of us has to constantly weigh trade-offs around all of these domains. That, I may have had a stronger network professionally and personally here in Massachusetts, but made the decision to move out to California for personal and professional reasons. And that meant that I was giving up that domain, or I was having some trade-offs related to the domain of social connectedness, and eventually moved back to Massachusetts because of that domain and wanting to support that. But what I really want to encourage people to think about, especially those of us in positions where we have more power over decisions in our organization, is how are we living this out with our colleagues? What are ways that we're supporting each of these domains within our organizations, not just for the folks who seek us out for services, but for the folks who we work with every single day? What is the opportunity to recognize that just as we all are supporting others and being able to access meaningful access to relevant resources, we all need that as well. Being able to recognize that it's not just annoying to not be able to see each other in person, have to do everything over Zoom, but it actually has a real impact on us because social connectedness is so often what has kept us feeling sustainable in this work. And so being able to recognize the impact that that has had, the impact on our ability to feel masterful when we're trying to figure out technology for the first time, well, at least for me, and trying to figure out how to convey messages and connect with people when we feel so disconnected. So part of this work is being able to recognize how stress can get stuck in us as individuals and us as a collective. How these uncompleted responses to trauma and stress will continue to show up in us until we find a way to metabolize and release them. Something I found to be really helpful in reading the book around burnout was thinking about the fact that We often know from supporting survivors that just because a traumatic event is over doesn't mean that their response to that event is also over. That very often we're still sorting through all the responses we have to those experiences for a very long, if not, you know, a lifetime, which is part of why a policy is saying someone has to be out of a relationship for X number of years or days or weeks or months is so problematic, because it's based in this misassumption that healing is linear. We all know survivors whose abuse ended decades ago, years ago, and it is still right here with them every single day. It is not up to us to determine when someone has to move on or when they should be, quote, over it. But even when the stressor is continuing, so even as we continue to live through so many chronic forms of trauma, we can do things every single day to address that stress response, to be able to support our bodies in releasing and metabolizing that response, to help us be healthier as individuals and to allow our organizations and this movement to be healthier and more sustainable overall. Stress, as I said, will live in our bodies. We've got an image there of all the ways that it can manifest physically, but it can also live in our systems. And so as we are conceptualizing what we can do collectively, I want to be thinking about what are opportunities we have for release. If we believe we are part of this larger movement, what does it mean to move together, collectively and with intention? So on an individual level, how we can help our bodies complete the cycle. Physical activity is going to be in many ways the most efficient, and that doesn't have to mean running a marathon, but moving in any way that is accessible and meaningful to us. And what I also want to say is that sometimes we may find that something we relied on as a self-care practice is no longer serving us. So I have gone through periods of time where running has been really healing for me, and times where I was really using it as an escape to numb. And so part of the work is just being able to cultivate that awareness of, is this serving the same purpose anymore? So it can be doing something as simple as cleaning the kitchen, cooking a meal, but really engaging your body and mind in the process of what you are doing. It can be tensing your muscles and slowly releasing them. Just being able to feel in your body a sense of movement and release. Being able to really cultivate awareness around breathing. And as some folks mentioned, noticing, what am I letting in? What do I need? And what do I need to release as I breathe out? So much of what we do for others is like one long exhale. We also need to inhale to be able to continue to exhale. So what do we need to feed ourselves? Simple positive social interaction, which I know is more challenging right now, but simply being able to wave to someone, masked and not able to see their face from across the street, a sense that the world can be a safe place for me right now in this moment. Positive social interaction, even over Zoom with loved ones or colleagues. Finding spaces and places for laughter, that really uncontrollable, deep belly laughter. When I started at Reach, laughter was the first thing I noticed. I feel so fortunate to work in an organization where I see people being sustainable in this work. It's part of why I wanted to work at Reach, because I saw people stay. And when I came to work there, we were in our old offices, which were very cramped and there wasn't enough space. But behind almost every single door, almost every single day, I heard real, genuine laughter. And that in of itself, that laughter of being shared together versus that cynical humor we mentioned before, to me, it became the symbol of what this organization was about, that we do hard work and we also find opportunities to find connection. Simple moments of affection. And again, it can be the same action, but being able to slow down for a moment. I was really feeling a lot of excitement and some nervousness entering into this morning's conversation. And I was saying goodbye to my daughter very quickly. And she just kept hugging me and kept giving me kisses, which I know is not going to be the case for much longer. And rather than rush through it, I just let myself sink into that for a moment. and just really be present for that. Normalizing and giving ourselves space to cry. I know there have been so many times where I have held those tears in because of what I was worried someone might think about me, that I might be considered less capable of doing my job. But if we give people the space and permission to cry, if we give that to ourselves, sometimes our fear that this crying will become all consuming and uncontrollable, when we really let ourselves just release and accept it as part of our body's natural response to releasing stress and tension, I find that the crying doesn't last very long, but it allows me to feel that sense of refreshed, of letting go. And then creative expression. And the more we allow ourselves space to do that, if we find ourselves, even with colleagues, taking a staff meeting to do something creative, to share laughter together, we may find that we have more energy that day and the next. So I'm sorry that I didn't get to share the TED Talk with you all, but I will definitely send the link so that you can watch it. But something that really stood with me in getting to see Laura now a few times in person and watching this TED Talk, probably 1,000 times a year, as I show it in so many trainings and spaces, is that it's so often really not about what we do, but how we do it. It is our ability to bring our, as she says, exquisite quality of presence to what you are doing and how you are being. So we can do the same work, but we can bring a completely different intention to it. And we can find that it can be transformational, not just for us, everyone around us. She offers this opportunity to call back on our ancestors and on people that we revere as people who created real meaningful change. And when they were unable to change anything external, they were able to shift everything as a result of where they put their focus. It's such a simple, small action, but it can have such a deep and lasting impact. Laura and the Trauma Stewardship Institute sent out a tiny survival guide, and I appreciate their thoughtfulness around tiny, recognizing that things that are big feel even more overwhelming to many of us right now. So at the beginning of the pandemic, they sent around this tiny survival guide. It gives some very specific concepts. Many of you mentioned these when I asked what you could do to take care of yourselves during today's conversation, to really be able, again, to support ourselves and being sustainable, not just in our work, but in our lives. And I love this last one, clarify intentions. How can I refrain from causing harm? And how can I contribute meaningfully? So when we serve from a place of constantly putting out and forgetting to fill ourselves, we may, for a short period of time, feel really justified in that. And we might get a lot of praise for it. I know that I did. I got a lot of recognition for doing so much and taking such terrible care of myself. And interestingly enough, it kind of came to a head in a very dramatic fashion. I had just been to the Trauma Stewardship Institute for the first time in California and felt very much like I really need to pay attention to how this work is impacting me. I've been noticing all these things for years, but I haven't quite figured out what to do about it yet. I need to start inspiring dialogue with my colleagues around this and thinking about how we can shift some of our own organizational culture. But I hadn't really let go of this value that, my value was in what I was able to do for others, no matter the cost. So I was in a role where I was on call pretty frequently, and my on-call shifts were always 24 hours. And so I had to do other things during that time. Sometimes it was teaching, sometimes it was sitting in traffic, and sometimes I would even sneak in an opportunity to do some self-care with my pager right next to me, knowing that I might have to leap into my car and drive off at a moment's notice. And so on this particular day, I went to a yoga class. I was living in San Francisco, and I got through the class with no calls. I felt really grateful to have had that time for myself. I was reflecting on all the things I heard in trauma stewardship. And as I was leaving, I was walking home, my pager went off. And so I called in, and it was a crisis call. I was supporting someone over the phone, and I was really hyper focused on their needs and wanting to make sure that they didn't hear any background noise or think that I was distracted in any way. And because I was so laser focused on their needs, and because people tend to drive really crazy in lots of places, I ended up getting hit by a car. And I remember rolling up on the hood, my phone going flying into the middle of the street, and everyone from the car and everyone from the sidewalk jumping out of the car, jumping, to aid me in some way. And I came off of the hood and I shushed everyone and I picked up the phone. It was one of those indestructible flip phones. And I held it to my ear and the survivor was still talking. And I just kept walking because I didn't want them to know what had happened. I didn't want them to be impacted by that. I didn't pay any attention to my physical needs until I'd finished the call, until I'd gotten home. And I had so much adrenaline in my body from that experience, I really didn't notice them until much later. And I had two very polarizing responses. The folks that were younger to this work and newer to the organization held me up on this pedestal and considered me the most badass advocate there ever had been. And the people who mentored me in this work and had been in it far longer than I had told me I really needed to examine how this work was impacting me. My hope is that no one else has to get struck by a car in order to have that realization, but that's what it took for me to realize that if I didn't pay better attention to this, it wasn't just about the impact that it would have on me. I was not going to be serving survivors or my communities the way that I really hoped to. I do this work and we do this work because we believe change is possible. If we hold caring for each other at the center of the work we do, I believe that our work will continue to grow and evolve and transform in ways that I can't even dream of. And it is so necessary, not just in thinking about the work of sexual and domestic violence prevention and intervention, but all the work we're doing to try to dismantle oppression and systems of imbalances of power. But we need to be able to do so from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. To do so, it is my hope that today can be one step in the direction of creating and fostering a web of support. We may not feel safe or comfortable in our workspaces to share the impact of this work or our personal experiences with our colleagues, and that's okay. But we all deserve to have a space where we can. And again, I implore those in leadership to really think about how are we modeling this and how are we offering those spaces to our colleagues. We have to invest in the people in order to make this a sustainable movement. So in our last few minutes together, I encourage you and request all of you to share with each other what has sustained you. What is a self-care practice that you've utilized during the pandemic that has been something that maybe you've done before or maybe is completely new to you? And one other thing I'll mention as folks begin to write in the chat is that what works for one person may not work for another. What works for me now at this point in my life is not the same as what worked for me 20 years ago when I first started this work. So really, so much of this is personal to you. I can see that I have a raised hand. I don't know if I have the ability to unmute folks. I would love to. What I will do is ask my friends from MOVA to help me with that. I'm just going to share with you all. You'll all get the slides. This is my contact information. I would love to continue the conversation. And thank you to MOVA for hosting this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if folks do have things they want to share, there's more opportunity to do so. And just want to share my deep, deep gratitude with all of you.